Welcome to a tutorial video on C# basics. In this video I'm going to discuss methods. We started to discuss methods in the previous video as they were part of the conversation around public and private variables and methods. We understand public and private to be descriptives of the relationship between objects. When a variable is public, it can be used outside of the object in which it is defined. When it is private, it cannot. The same applies to methods. As we saw in the previous video, we were able to access the private member data using a public method. Methods within C# are similar to functions in other programming languages. We can think of them as sets of instructions. They're different from variables, which can also be public and private as discussed in the previous video, in that they can return data. We can send data in and we can get data out. This is important because it helps us think through the relationship between objects and how we think about code and control within C# when we're writing code. That is, we can think about ways to abstract out code as sets of instructions we can then call, that is, use a method to do some small task for us and to then put these all together as a series of tasks to solve a complex problem or a problem that has multiple steps. So let's come over here and look at the code to start to think about that. Again, we're using the keyword using at the very top of this, and we see using system. Next, similar to the last video, we have a public class person. In this video, however, we now have two private members here. Private string underscore name and private string underscore ID. Note, because they are private, they cannot be accessed outside. So we can no longer use person.name to get the data of name like we could in the previous video when it was public. So these are both private and we can no longer get to them. Well, I mentioned that methods return stuff. We can also send information into methods. And we saw that when we were using this constructor, as I mentioned in the previous video. A constructor is a special type of method in that it helps construct the object in which it is a part. So we see public person, string name, string ID. The two things within parentheses here are parameters. Those are things we're sending into the method. So we're sending two things, the first of which is string name, the second of which is string ID. Within that method, the name of the parameters contain whatever values were sent into that method. So we can use name to get the value of the name parameter and ID, capital ID, to get the data that was sent in using that parameter. So we see this right here, name and ID. The other thing that's important to think through when we're using methods that are part of an object is that an object has a way to reference itself. This is the this keyword, and it's actually common across many programming languages. In the case of C#, we can use the this keyword to reference itself and its own members. Because it can access things that are private to it, we can change the value of underscore name and underscore ID. And in fact, we're doing that right here. Line 29 says, when you get the value of the first parameter passed into this, assign it to this dot underscore name. So the name member of this object we're currently looking at. And we see this again on line 31, the this keyword referring to person and its member underscore ID. These are private members to person, but because they are private to person, person can understand them. So we see here, whatever's passed into name becomes underscore name, whatever's passed in as ID becomes underscore ID. And this allows us to construct this object by passing in initial data. So we see the special case of a method as a constructor. We've also seen methods before. We've been using them throughout all of these videos, and in fact, public static void main is a method, a special type of method, that we've been using repeatedly here to use console write line, another method, to show different data on the console. When we're using console WriteLine, it was producing content on the console. It is called within this greater method as part of a member of this class public static void main, which is a very special name and means run this thing. So when this whole file is compiled, public static void main, this method, will be run, and anything within this will pull from other things within this file, which you may have understood implicitly, although I did not spell it out explicitly in the previous video. And in fact, we saw that when we were talking through creating an object based on the type person. In the previous video, we were creating demo as a new object of type person with initial value of demo, and then the second parameter of 1, 2, 3, 4 as an integer. In this video, for demonstration purposes, both of these are now strings. So we're calling a new person as if it were a method, and because it is a constructor, we use the new keyword that creates a new object person and sends in these values using these name and ID as parameters, which we started to see in the previous video. So demo and 1, 2, 3, 4 are set as part of the new object, or it's calling the method of the constructor, which we see right here, and I've reviewed at length. So let's run this, and we see demo 1, 2, 3, 4, which we also saw in the previous video. But things have gotten a little different. Down here in console WriteLine, we see a somewhat confusing thing. We see demo.name and demo.id. Well, as we saw in the previous video, we couldn't access ID because it was private. But it seems as if we can now access it. The way we're doing that is similar to how we did it in the previous video. We're using a public method to get private data. Now, though, we're using something special that C# does, and that is something called get and set. Within C#, we can use the keywords get and set to describe those operations within a method of that same name. So right here we have a public string name. This acts as if it is a method. It is a special type of method. And the two things it does is get and set. As we saw in the previous video, when we wanted to get a value, I called it get ID. We were getting the ID. Well, these two operations, get and set, are so common within programming that C# has made them keywords and allows us to define them as short sections right here. So if we're getting a public string name, we can define the two different actions that happen when we use those. In this case, get returns underscore name. Underscore name is private, but it's private to person, which means we can return it as part of this public method. We could also send a new value in using set, so we could describe it as person.name is equal to something, and that new value would be assigned. Down here for ID, we see the same thing. We can use get and set as special keywords within C# to define these relationships within a method ID that returns a string. So it looks as if it is a method, but uses get and set to do special operations that are part of C# that allows us to very quickly define these common tasks. So let's review all of this. As I've talked about across these videos, C# expects objects. We define an object using a class. So the expectation of a class here is first met through the public class person. Person has member data defined through line 34. In this example, we have two variables, private string name and private string underscore ID. As we saw, we can't access these because they're private. However, we can use the special functionality within C# to define methods that are public within that object to allow us to access that private data. So we see here public string name and public string ID. These act as if they were variables, but allows us to use them as methods in the same way, so we can get and set data. So we see special keywords get and set, and what should happen within their curly brackets. For this example of get, return underscore name, set underscore name is equal to whatever value is passed in, and the same for ID. We also discussed how constructors are a special type of method that allows us to create a new object and pass in data using its parameters at the same time. And so we passed in name and ID and used the this keyword to define the this object it's talking about. So this dot underscore name is equal to the name as part of this person object, and the same with this dot underscore ID was also equal to the ID that was private to this person object. We saw all of that of action down here on line 49 when we created a new object demo of type person and sent in the parameters demo as a string and 1234 as a string. Then we were able to see the get and set in action down here with demo.name and demo.id. When run, showed us demo and 1234 both as strings returned using the get and set keywords as public to get private data within the person object. Thanks for watching.